Today's podcast is brought to you in part by Jeb Taylor Knives. Jeb Taylor Knives, fine cutlery for the kitchen and outdoors, handcrafted in Rochester, Minnesota. Find them on Facebook, Instagram, or at www.jebtaylorknives.com. This podcast is also brought to you today by Brendan Bush Photography. Dubbed the new handshake, professional headshots are now the first introduction to you, your business, and your personal brand. Shouldn't that intro be the best it can be? Brendan Bush Photography is Rochester's business headshot photographer. Whether you're an entrepreneur looking for a social media image upgrade or a large business that wants a staff headshot today, Brendan can accommodate your needs. Find out more at www.brendanbushphotography.com. That's www.brendanbushphotography.com. I'm Amanda Leitner, and welcome to Rochester Rising, where we amplify the stories of Rochester entrepreneurs. Welcome to episode 152 of the podcast today. So today it'll just be me talking about a wonderful new initiative, really a brand new initiative taking place in Rochester, in Minnesota right now, called Launch Minnesota. If you have not heard about it yet, you should. Although Launch Minnesota officially started just this October, it's a statewide initiative supported by the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development and the Minnesota State Legislature to help make Minnesota one of the top destinations for high-growth potential technology startups. So we cover a lot of ground on the podcast today, talking about Launch Minnesota and what it has to offer for the state and how you can benefit from this brand new initiative in the state of Minnesota. So stay tuned today. We have a great podcast for you. And as always, you can find more of our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen into your podcast content. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram with the hashtag @RochesterRising. And we're also on YouTube, so you can find us at all those locations. And our podcasts are usually on YouTube, unless my computer is crashing, which it has been lately. But most of our podcasts end up on our YouTube channel as well. So if that's your preferred way to consume, you can find it there. All right, so now on to the podcast, talking about Launch Minnesota. So I had the great opportunity this past Friday to join the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development for a Southeastern Minnesota Economic Development Professionals meeting that was held in Orinoco. And it was really a great mix between different types of business development. We kind of started off the day learning about Main Street development. So why a vibrant Main Street is important, what this means for the business community, and how you can bring those programs to your community. And then we also heard about Launch Minnesota from the magnificent Nilo Mulgard, the brand new executive director of Launch Minnesota. A lot of you probably know Neela from her previous capacity as the executive director of Red Wing Ignite. With Red Wing Ignite, Neela helped run their co-working space in Red Wing, but she also really helped to support entrepreneurs throughout southeastern Minnesota. And as she was leaving Red Wing Ignite, she was also the main author on a $750,000 grant that Red Wing Ignite just recently received from the U.S. Department of Commerce. So she's done fantastic work there and can't wait to see what she does with this new initiative. So what is Launch Minnesota? So Launch Minnesota is a brand new initiative that is supported at this point through the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development, or Minnesota DEED, and it was designed through the Minnesota Legislature. And the goal of Launch Minnesota is to help launch Minnesota's startup ecosystem. We'll dive into this a lot more later in the podcast, but really there's three buckets of support that Launch Minnesota is providing: innovation grants, educational grants, and an angel tax credit. So the main goal of Launch Minnesota is to help Minnesota. So it's a statewide initiative in Minnesota that will help to accelerate startups and amplify Minnesota as a leader in innovation. The goal is to make Minnesota one of the top 5 innovative states in the United States. A lot of the nuances of Launch Minnesota has really been driven by legislation at the state level, especially in regards to the types of businesses that Launch Minnesota will serve. And through legislation, this has been designated that Launch Minnesota will serve innovative, scalable businesses. Typically, this would mean things that have some intellectual property associated with it, so patents, trademarks that are scalable. So this would not be your bricks and mortar businesses or your main street businesses. Launch Minnesota has an annual budget of $2.5 million, and they will give special consideration to resources and startups located in greater Minnesota, so anywhere outside of the Twin Cities region, and startups or resources run by women, veterans, and people of color. This program, or Launch Minnesota, made its official debut just on October 1st, so it's a brand new initiative. So as I mentioned, Launch Minnesota is specifically for innovative, scalable businesses in the tech space, including startups operating in aerospace, agricultural processing, biotechnology, environmental engineering, food technology, information technology, medical device, nanotechnology, pharmaceuticals, and veterinary sciences. So Launch Minnesota is supported by the executive director, Anila Mogard, as well as a 10-person advisory board. This board has a lot of diverse expertise. It includes scientists, startup entrepreneurs, investors, higher education, and it includes 2 individuals from Southeast Minnesota. The first is Christine Beach, the executive director of the Kabara Institute for Entrepreneurial Studies through St. Mary's University of Minnesota. And the second individual on the Launch Minnesota Advisory Board is Xavier Fergola, the director of entrepreneurship at READY, or Rochester Area Economic Development, Inc. So it's really great to have these 2 wonderful individuals from Southeast Minnesota on the Launch Minnesota Advisory Panel. So really the goal of this advisory panel is to evaluate the innovation grants, which I'll talk about more in a little bit, but the innovation grants are the grants that will be going to Minnesota-based tech startups. And a lot of the role of the board will really be to assess what Launch Minnesota looks like in the future. So as I mentioned in the top, Launch Minnesota right now is supported by the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development. So it's 100% funded by Minnesota DEED. So this is really taxpayer dollars going to support this, which is a wonderful thing. But ideally, moving into the future, Launch Minnesota does not want to be 100% supported by the government. So thinking about how this program will become more of a public-private partnership. So that's one of the goals in the near future after this initial pilot operations is complete. And the 3 major goals of Launch Minnesota is to develop capital, culture, and talent. And I'll talk a lot more about that as we dive in a little bit more here. So in regards to capital, like I said, there are a couple different buckets of money that Launch Minnesota has. And the first is our innovation grants. So these are to support business operations. There's also some money for housing and childcare expenses and for SBIR, STTR Phase 2 matches. So I'll go into those a little bit more here. So the business operations are really for any kind of research and development work, prototyping, anything like that. So through Launch Minnesota, tech companies can apply for grant funding up to $35,000. These innovation grants also offer housing and childcare, can cover housing and childcare expenses up to $7,500. So this is really great. So we talk about a lot of what happens when you leave your job to run a startup is that there's a lot of risk involved, especially, a lot of the times you're paying for your own healthcare. You don't know when you're going to get paid again. So some of this de-risking in terms of offering essentially a housing and childcare credit in the form of a grant is just wonderful. really helps to reduce that risk and mitigate the burden a little bit for people pursuing high growth potential startups in the state. So this is fantastic. So if you remember some of the original discussions around Launch MN, they thought, or there was some discussion about giving an expense for healthcare, but it ended up coming down or being written as a housing and childcare expense offering. So that's available. And the third bucket of money is $50,000 to match SBIR STTR Phase 2 grants. So SBIR STTRs, if you listen to the last podcast with the Kalmaz brothers, these are basically grants available to biotech companies, pharmaceutical companies, something operating in the healthcare space, and or research institutions that help to commercialize healthcare or biotech technology. So take it from bench through bedside to patient care. So the very important thing about all of these grants, the business operations, the housing and childcare expenses, and the SBIR STTR matches, is these are matches. They're one-to-one matches. So the awardee, the startup receiving the money, must have a match. So if it's a business operations match and you're asking grant and you're asking for $35,000, you have to have $35,000 from some other source as well. You can have received this money before receiving the Launch Minnesota money, but it cannot be spent yet. So again, the innovation grants through Launch Minnesota require a one-to-one match. These innovation grants are live now on the Launch Minnesota website at launchmn.org. That's launchmn.org. They will be reviewed on a rolling basis by the advisory board. Applications that are received by November 30th will be reviewed in early December. It looks like on December 1st, and the awardees will be announced in January. So if you get your application in by the end of November, you can potentially be awarded money in January, and these grants in the innovation grants sector will be awarded on a rolling basis. So check it out at launchmn.org. So we're just going to pause for a moment here to hear from some of our sponsors. So this podcast is also sponsored in part by Leah Labs. Do you love dogs and hate cancer? Have you ever wanted to be a startup investor? You have a unique opportunity to invest in a startup with a great mission at Leah Labs. Leah Labs is a Rochester, Minnesota-based company working to bring modern cancer cures to dogs. Invest in Leah, receive equity, help save dogs from cancer. Visit www.wefunder.com/Leah to learn more. That's www.wefunder.com/LEAH to learn more. Today's podcast is also sponsored in part by Rochester Home Infusion. Rochester Home Infusion provides intravenous medications where it's comfortable and convenient for you in your hotel, home, or temporary residence so that you can get back to living your life. Find out more by visiting them at rochesterhomeinfusion.com or calling them at 507-316-0001. Again, that's 507-316-0001. All right, so now back to the podcast. So again, for these innovation grants, they're being supported by taxpayer dollars, so really putting taxpayer dollars at high risk. So these grants will be extremely competitive, and a competitive business to receive the grant will be well beyond the ideation stage. So just thinking about the legislative process, these startups potentially receiving money will have to be able to show clearly definable progress over a year and a half to show that the program has been successful. So again, they have to be really well beyond the ideation stage and are ready for capital input. So they have to have traction to really be competitive for these innovation grants. So kind of this second bucket of support offered by Launch Minnesota is the Angel Tax Credit. So we're very familiar with this in the state of Minnesota. So it's a 25% credit to investors. So it's really incentivizing investment into Minnesota high growth potential startups. There is still some money left for the Angel Tax Credit in 2019. The angel tax credit will go away for 2020, but there's $10 million allocated for this tax credit by the Minnesota State Legislature for 2021. So again, this will go away for 2020. There's some buckets of money for the angel tax credit still available for 2019 until that fund is gone. And then it will open back up in 2021 to incentivize investment into high growth potential Minnesota startups. So this third bucket of support offered by Launch Minnesota are education and entrepreneurial ecosystem grants. So these are really meant to tackle that issue of culture. So to really foster a culture of collaboration, to enable sharing of information and best practices across sectors and regions, to connect entrepreneurs to the best resources available statewide to help accelerate and launch Minnesota-based startups, and to elevate and enhance assets and efforts already taking place in the state. So the goal with the entrepreneurial ecosystem grants and education grants is to enhance what is already going on in the state. Launch Minnesota does not want to duplicate anything or own anything. They aren't doing any programs themselves. Their real goal with these entrepreneurial ecosystem development grants is to increase the talent pipeline, increase knowledge for startups and mentors around the space, and be able to connect them to entrepreneurs. And especially with our education grants, the state has really adopted a lean startup model for education as the best practice for high growth potential startup development. So we'll talk about Lean Startup in our podcast next week. But basically, Lean Startup adopts a scientific-like approach to startup development where the entrepreneur has a business hypothesis of what the value and need is for their business, and then they go out and test that through customer feedback ideally prior to creating a product or service, and creates the product or service as a minimally viable product. So the most basic product that would work to satisfy the need, and basically builds for the user. With these education entrepreneurial ecosystem grants, there will be $450,000 available across the entire state this year. Applications will open today. So these will not be awarded to a single organization. So really thinking about this from an ecosystem level. Launch Minnesota is really looking for applications from entire regions. And it seems like they're leaning towards, well, we'll know when the RFP or the request for proposal comes out today, but I'm guessing based on what was discussed last Friday at Orinoco, that these regions will closely follow the Minnesota deed region. So we'd be looking at an application from the entire southeast Minnesota region. So the maximum education and entrepreneurial ecosystem grant would be $75,000. This is for organizations already doing this work. It's not for capacity building. So the organizations applying together must already be doing the work. The grant is also available for some statewide organizations, but again, these are not to expand capacity. So the organization or organizations would already have to be operating at a statewide level. So these grants are for doing the actual work with entrepreneurs, so for enhancing this type of work that's already going on. Again, these are not for building up your organization or creating something new, and they're really looking for these to be collaborative with multiple organizations from one region going in together to submit a grant application for asking for up to $75,000. And again, the request for proposal will be released today from Launch Minnesota, and they will be due on January 3rd. And really the deliverables from these education and economic and entrepreneurial ecosystem development grants are to develop the pipeline, so to educate startups, develop the ecosystem, help move more ideas to reality, and help to reduce risk capital. So that's the basics of Launch Minnesota. If you think your business is a good fit for the innovation grants, or you're interested in these entrepreneurial ecosystem development grants, please head to their website at launchmn.org to learn more, and please consider applying if you fit the criteria. This is a great new initiative for our state, and we're looking forward to see what it can do for our startup ecosystem. And I think especially as an entrepreneurial ecosystem builder, having this entrepreneurial ecosystem grant or the potential of this grant is really saying something from the state. To my knowledge and to a lot of others' knowledge, this is really the first time that this concept of entrepreneurial ecosystem building, supporting entrepreneurs, building that culture and organizational support for entrepreneurs, not just in your organization, but across a community, is really a new thing. And it's very hard to financially support. So for the state to come in and say that they recognize this and recognize the need for it is huge. So again, highly encourage people to consider the innovation grants, making use of the Minnesota Angel Tax Credit if that's applicable to your business, and thinking about these education and entrepreneurial ecosystem development grants. And you can find more information at launchmn.org, and we'll also have that website in our show notes. All right, just a quick word from our remaining sponsors. So this podcast is also sponsored in part by Live Atom. Live Atom helps businesses grow online by generating more leads. You can find out more about them at liveatom.com. That's liveatom.com. Today's show is also brought to you by Rochester Area Economic Development, Inc., or READY. READY connects technology-based entrepreneurs to local resources to support and help grow their companies. READY manages a technology incubator downtown called the Mayo Clinic Business Accelerator and administers 2 investment funds that invest in new companies. Go to ready.com for more information. That's RAEDI.com. So thanks for listening to the podcast today. To learn more about Launch Minnesota, again, we're all really excited to see what this can do for the startup ecosystem, both for the entrepreneurs and for the entrepreneurial ecosystem builders, and really looking forward to what Neela will do in her new role as executive director. So again, if you enjoyed the podcast today, you can find us on our website at rochesterrising.org. We're also on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. And a really great way to stay up to date is to subscribe to our weekly newsletter. You'll get the newsletter every Monday morning. It'll have all the stories that we had this week, including links to our podcasts. And we've also started to put in stories from around our entrepreneurial ecosystem. So check it out and stay up to date on the latest developments in Rochester's entrepreneurial scene. Thanks for tuning in to the podcast today. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts and rate us so that others can find us. We'll be back next week with a brand new episode.